This is the IBJ podcast for the week of March 23rd, 2020, brought to you by the law firm Krieg DeVault. I'm Mason King. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. Well, let's get right to it. With astonishing speed, the coronavirus crisis has expanded from a public health emergency to an economic calamity that threatens to rival the Great Recession. And the cruel paradox is that in order to save lives, we've been directed to stay at home, if at all possible, and basically stay away from each other. And that has yanked shut the spigot of consumer spending necessary to keep our economy healthy. States are beginning to report huge surges of applicants for unemployment benefits. Schools are empty. Travel is at a near standstill. Big conventions have been canceled. Hotels are beginning to close or say that they're considering it. And hospitals can't even seat patrons and are trying to make do with carryout and delivery, God bless them. Most economists say a rough recession is imminent if we're not already in one. And you know most of this already. The next questions are, how do we get through it? What can businesses do to survive? Is the government stimulus program going to help? How long is this going to last? And is Indianapolis in a particularly bad position because a good chunk of our economy is based on convention, hospitality, and restaurant business? To get some answers and a better sense of the tough conditions we can expect over the next few months, I asked economist Phil Powell to share his expertise. He is Associate Dean of Academic Programs in Indianapolis for Indiana University Kelley School of Business, and he's an expert at business economics and public policy. And he's been neck deep in this, helping to advise Indy area businesses on their next steps. This is a fascinating interview, and I hope it's helpful. Phil, thanks for making time to speak with me today.
Absolutely, Mason. Good to be here.
You have graciously agreed to meet me in the IBJ podcast studio on Monument Circle. We are, maybe you can confirm for our listeners, we are at least 3 feet apart.
This is correct. We are. We meet social distancing standards.
That's good. You've wiped down your microphone. We're all set. I do want to get to what we're seeing in Indianapolis, or at least how Indianapolis is being affected and will continue to be affected by this sudden downturn triggered by coronavirus. But first, just to orient everybody, can you very briefly give me the 25,000-foot view in the United States? What are the 2 or 3 changes or trends that are most worrisome right now?
Well, I think that the way to see this is that basically the country is shutting off for at least 6 to 10 weeks. If you look at what's happened in China and South Korea. And by the way, China and South Korea are slowly getting back to business. So what happens when you shut off an economy like that? It's the extremist version of a blizzard, except much more serious because people are dying and people are more scared. When that happens, it basically shuts off revenue for 30, 60, 90 days. And when nobody's spending money, when businesses are not open, it creates this negative multiplier effect that just ripples through the economy instantly. And so I'm worried about how our business is going to survive in terms of maintaining enough cash to overcome the costs that they got to incur to keep themselves alive. Secondly, I'm worried about how this impacts the lower part of our income distribution, because while our most skilled workers can work from home and continue to earn a paycheck, the folks in the service sector, if you're a waiter or you do something that's physical, requires physical human contact, and your business can't afford to employ you, you have to fall back on unemployment insurance, which is some cash, but it's not going to be enough to meet your needs. So those are really the 2 things that worry me the most. And the third thing is just really the psychology. I would argue that culturally, among most nations on the planet, we are the least prepared to deal with this psychologically.
Why would that be? I mean, I feel like we just went through a recession. I mean, I remember it vividly.
What's different about this is the sense of personal threat. You know, it's not just losing your job, it could be losing your life. And as Americans, the biggest contribution to our economic success has been our sense of individualism. By far, we are the most entrepreneurial economy in the world by any measure. Innovation, productivity growth, these types of things. With that comes this pride of smaller government, of you got to do it on your own. But when you get to a public health crisis, this works against us in two ways. Our government is not as prepared. And secondly, as Americans, we're used to being able to control our reality. We don't have a healthy sense of fatalism that you find around other parts of the world that allow people to handle uncertainty and threat.
That is just fascinating. I've just been all over the place mentally for the last couple of weeks, and I was just thinking about, I bet the people in France, who are I guess 80% existentialists, are probably maybe a little bit more mentally prepared to handle something like this.
Even the British.
Yeah.
I mean, the British have that stiff upper lip.
Mm-hmm.
They kept business going while bombs were falling from German bombers during the Second World War. So we've been spoiled as a nation, and now we're just not prepared psychologically to face this.
My understanding was that consumer spending was a huge part of the economy and why it was still growing, or at least, still in a positive territory, and that this thing seems to be weaponized against consumer spending. Is that an accurate read?
Absolutely. Nobody's leaving their house. Yeah. Consumer spending is 2/3 of our national economy. Right now, you can be seeing a 20, 30, 40% hit on daily consumer spending. That's huge. And typically, actually, consumer spending is a more stable part of the economic equation than say, business spending. So the pain that we're going to feel is going to be unprecedented. But again, if we follow the trajectory that we're seeing in South Korea and China, and there's every reason to believe that we can, this will be a short but extremely painful event.
See, when you say the word pain, I'm already scared. What do we mean by pain?
Massive job loss. Businesses closing. I've looked at the numbers. I've been running data. My best guess right now on March 18th is that we're looking at 3 months of economic paralysis. And then 3 months of, once you start to get things back together, things will bounce back up pretty quick.
Mm-hmm.
It's important for the listeners to understand that this is very different from 2008 in that this is not being driven by misalignments in the financial markets. If you look at balance sheets, if you look at a lot of our economic indicators, the economy is pretty solid. I mean, it's got some weak points, but this economy is much more fundamentally sound than it was in 2007, 2008. What we're going to feel is a much different type of shock. It's just like, again, it's like the country's closes for business for this quarter.
Mm-hmm.
For folks that are living paycheck to paycheck, for businesses that are living from deal to deal, they're not prepared for this. And so that's why it's important that policies that we're seeing, the extension of credit, the extension of liquidity, the extension of emergency loans is so key to helping see our businesses and our whole citizenry through this very painful quarter that we're going to experience.
Is it as simple as, once the lights go back on, once we all get the all clear to go about our business, that it's just going to bounce right back and we'll be fine?
It will be a very quick bounce back. I've been fielding questions from small businesses. I got an email yesterday from a company that does video production, and they were talking about how everybody's canceled their stuff. And I said, well, the key is just to stay alive. And then when these social controls are lifted and everybody starts to feel good about things, you're going to probably see a sudden surge because your clients are going to have a backlog. Now, some of those clients may have gone bankrupt. I think that's the hard part is that, yes, business will come back, but it will come back from clients that's economically survived. And surviving is an issue of having enough cash to stay solvent and pay your fixed expenses.
Is that the question you're getting from businesses right now is how do I survive?
Yes, and that's what we're telling them.
Yeah.
The Kelley School of Business is part of the Rapid Response Initiative from the Indianapolis Chamber of Commerce. If you go to response.indychamber.com, if you're a small business here in Indiana or anywhere, you can send an email in and get your questions answered. And we're answering questions for businesses that are asking these more strategic questions, what do I do? And the two messages are, this is about survival. A better day will be here. It's your job to survive and to make sure that when these social controls are lifted and everybody starts to come back out, that you're ready for business.
And what do they need to survive?
Well, they need cash. So this is your time to draw upon cash reserves if you have them. Not a lot of businesses have cash reserves. If you have a line of credit, draw upon it. Seek out the SBA or government assistance. The Fed is about to flood the market with liquidity.
What does that mean, liquidity?
Well, loans, so credit. And I think that there's a lot of business owners out there that might think it's going to be very difficult to get a loan. And they might be surprised that they start to call their bank or they call the Indy Chamber and see how to get a hold of the SBA loans, the Small Business Administration loans from the federal government. Also, we're encouraging businesses to approach their creditors or if they're leasing equipment and say, look, I've got a healthy group of customers and I just need to get through this storm. Creditors and leasing agents have as much interest in their clients not going bankrupt as the clients do. So if you're a small business owner and you listen to this podcast, the folks that you owe money to have as much interest in you staying in business as you do. Mm-hmm. So they're going to be more willing to negotiate creative short-term arrangements so that you're still around when the economy does bounce back. And when it bounces back, it's going to bounce back pretty quick. That's the good news, but it's hard. I think it's hard for us to get anybody, even me as an economist that studies the Indianapolis economy, to get my head around what's going on. But when you step back and you think about it rationally, this is the worst. We're getting to the next 2 weeks are going to be the worst, and it will get better.
And what is it about the next 2 weeks?
If you look at what's happening in Spain, Italy, and France, and Europe, and you also look at what happened in Asia, what you see is about 2 to 3 weeks of this, oh my gosh. Mm-hmm. And you see this ratcheting up of social controls. That's the period that we're in. And then you see about 6 to 8 weeks of shelter in place. So this is what gets me to my point about 3 months of absolute paralysis. During this period of paralysis, it's just about waking up and saying, if I survived another day as a business, I'm winning.
All right, let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ Podcast.
The IBJ Podcast is brought to you by Krieg DeVault, a trusted and dynamic law firm representing a wide variety of local, regional, and national clients. Committed to each other and to every client, Krieg DeVault prides itself on integrity, professionalism, respect, and excellence. Financial institutions, global manufacturers, national healthcare providers, and successful organizations of all sizes and market focus rely on Krieg DeVault to create innovative and successful business solutions. Connect today at www.kriegdevault.com.
All right, we're back with the IBJ Podcast. Of course, this week we're talking about the coronavirus crisis and the looming recession. Our guest is economist Phil Powell of Indiana University's Kelley School of Business. Well, let's look at Indianapolis a little bit closer then. The economy here, specifically the economy of downtown, is based in really good part on the convention industry. You know, hospitality, hotels, restaurants, people coming from Dubuque for a convention. And it seems like those three sectors, those economic niches, are really in the top tier of the sectors being disrupted, especially by social distancing. Am I reading that right?
Absolutely. Hospitality, restaurants, travel, entertainment, these sectors in all American cities and all European cities are the most hit in terms of the short-term pain.
Now, I know in the convention industry, we're obviously hampered by the ability to congregate, and air travel is almost completely halted. Is it going to be able just to bounce back in 3 months? Is everyone just going to say, well, reschedule me for September and we're good to go?
No, it's not, because if you're a medical conference, say, or you're a Comic-Con or whatever, and your event is in midsummer, you're looking at going, well, do I go ahead and cancel it? So while when we start to bounce back, we'll see residents return to the restaurants pretty quickly. The convention business is probably going to take at least 3 quarters to recover.
Is there any damage of long-term damage to the convention industry?
The damage to the convention industry here in town is going to be linked hand in hand with the disease. And the question is are there going to be multiple peaks?
Of infections for COVID.
Right.
Yeah.
So, you're hearing from the White House about how the worst case scenario is an 18-month plan where, as I read it, you would have these peaks and then it get better, and it peaks and it get better.
Just peaks of infections of people.
Right.
Yeah.
And the question is, are we going to have another peak? And if you look at the long history of infectious diseases, there's typically a second peak, typically in fall. And again, I'm not a public health expert, but that's correlated to the economic activity. So in the worst case scenario of an 18-month, that this runs its course in 18 months, then you're going to just have conventions just not happening out of abundance of caution. And that's my biggest fear. And so then the damage is that who's left standing after 18 months of no business? I think that Washington and I think all of our support structures here in the city are rallying to help get businesses through a 2, 3, 4 month rough period. But an 18-month impact here is just unfathomable.
We talked a little bit about this before we started the podcast. I would assume that hotels would be especially vulnerable in the situation where people just don't know what to expect.
Well, the hotels are built to accommodate the convention business.
Right.
And we're one of the leading cities for that. So if I'm a hotel owner and I'm getting 10% occupancy, I can't even cover my variable expenses. So I'm just going to shut the place down until that business returns.
Yeah, and IBJ reported this morning, actually, this is Thursday, the two largest hotels, the owners of the two largest hotels, the JW Marriott, which has 1,000 rooms, and the downtown Marriott in Indianapolis, which has somewhere between 600 and 700 rooms, are very seriously considering temporarily closing. Is that the best, most effective response to something like this?
Let me try to frame this for everybody listening on the podcast that owns a business, whether it's small or big,
Sure.
right? You've got three things that you've got to think about in terms of survival. You've got variable expenses, you've got keeping your core staff, and you've got your fixed expenses. This is things like insurance and leases and rent and paying off your debt. To stay solvent, you've got to cover your fixed expenses. And you do that with other types of credit, or you do that with cash reserves. You also want to make sure that you keep your core staff, because if you just get rid of your core staff and don't do anything for them, if you have the ability, you're not going to be open for business when things do reopen. And then you got your variable expenses. Well, if I'm a hotel and I'm at such low, if I'm a restaurant and I only have 3 diners each night, I'm not even covering my variable expenses. When I can't cover my variable expenses, it makes the biggest sense to close shop. And then what do? You sort of go into hibernation. I think that's how we need to think about this. This is like a deep freeze that we're experiencing.
You mentioned the restaurants. I know a lot of them obviously are going to try to make a go of it, just doing takeout and carry out. I don't think every kind of restaurant can do that. I don't think fine dining restaurants can do that. For those guys like the St. Elmo's out there, is the solution just to mothball it?
It depends. I mean, that takeout business is, we love to eat out, right? And in fact, because of the pain that we're feeling, you might find the average household more willing to do takeout because the food tastes better. They want to splurge. They want to feel better. So if I'm St. Elmo's, think creatively, right? For example, if you want to have some revenue coming in, you could sell gift cards for later use, right, at a discount. I'm going to thin down my operation. But if I can cover my variable expenses and still be making some revenue, you stay open. But it's just all about, can you cover those variable expenses?
And when we say variable expenses, what are those again?
So these would be your wages, your electricity, your materials cost, the cost of your perishables. These are expenses that you incur when you're open for business, right? When you're not open for business, you're not paying wages because nobody's coming to work. But you still have to pay your contractual arrangements for like rent and leases and that type of thing. And that's what you still have to keep paying to keep yourself solvent, to keep yourself alive.
With everything basically in hibernation, as you say, do you have a sense of like how much economic activity is lost in Marion County because of this?
We do know the following. So JP Morgan came out with a forecast that the next 2 quarters will be worse, unquestionably worse than the first 2 quarters after the 2008 financial crisis.
Wow.
Now, the pain's not going to be as long term, but it's going to be, as I said earlier, very painful, but very short in the time frame of the economy. But let's run some numbers, right? So we know that in any metropolitan economy, consumer spending is about 2/3 of economic activity. So if consumers are maybe spending 2/3 of that, so you're looking at easily a 15 to 20% fall in just consumer activity for the next 2 months, right? And that doesn't count, that's just consumer spending. That doesn't count the reduction in business spending, slowing down projects, furloughing deals, these types of things. The impact is going to be 10, 20, 30% of economic activity for the next at least 2 months.
You mentioned hotels. We've been reporting pretty consistently about the 2021 different hotel projects that are in various stages of completion. Some are close to being done. Some are still maybe even looking for financing. Is there going to be any movement at anything like that until this is
No.
Until we get
no,
the
those
all
are
clear?
those are on halt.
Yeah.
And those were here to serve a regional economy that was in really good shape and growing pretty quickly. So those projects, I don't start to make money on those projects until we're past the threat of the virus, the economic threat of the virus, right? You can still have a health threat, but it doesn't have economic impact if it's contained.
One of the devious things about this downturn is that it inordinately affects people in the service industries who live paycheck to paycheck. Give me a sense of what their challenges are at the moment.
It's a sense of desperation. It's sudden, and it's not of their own accord. 3 weeks ago, the economy was running great. You had no reason to suspect it. And even if the service workers have been financially frugal and have saved a couple of months of income, maybe they can cover themselves. And that's the best case scenario, right? I mean, these folks have families. They don't make enough money to put back 6 months or a year of cash. These workers are feeling desperate. This is why it's so important that what we're seeing come out of Washington is going to mean a lot to these folks. The president, I think, was talking about a $2,000 check for every American, or a $1,000 check, as Mitt Romney was talking about. This could mean the difference between just absolute economic collapse for families.
The way that I think it's being pitched by the White House and the Treasury Department right now is that there would be a $1 trillion overall plan. $500 billion of that would basically be sent to American people to help them get through whatever they're trying to get through. And yeah, it could be, depending on like how big your family is, depending on what your income is, you would get 1 or 2 checks, and each I think would be about $1,000. I don't know what to make of that. Is that an effective way of dealing with
Absolutely.
the problem?
Again, the same prescription I've talked about for businesses is the same for households, right? They've got to survive economically. They got to meet their fixed costs. If you're a family, what are your fixed costs? It's your light bill. It's your mortgage, or it's your rent payment. These checks from the government are going to help these households not be on the street before this happens. Now, I know the federal government's also talked, and local governments have also talked about restrictions on evictions and these types of things. Yeah. But it's better if people can pay those mortgages. And so I think that the rapid response in terms of getting checks to people, especially folks at the lower end of the income spectrum, are essential. This is about survival for 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks.
Is there a potential for any kind of domino effect where you have so many people from one income bracket just being out of commission for a while that it would trigger something else in the economy?
I think it's already happening. It's what economists would call a negative multiplier. My wife and I are going out. I'm not spending as much money. We typically eat 2 or 3 times a week. We're not eating out. Everybody's just not spending money. When we can't get together in person, we can't generate value. Why do people trade? Why do they pay for stuff? It's because they get value out of it. And the only way you have economic growth is if you have value. I think we're seeing it, Mason. It's upon us.
We've started hearing just this week that we are either in or are headed into a severe global recession. We know to be afraid of that word, but what does recession mean exactly?
Technically defined, a recession is 2 quarters of negative gross domestic product growth. Okay. Gross domestic product is our measure of total activity.
So that's like the report that you just referred to that is predicting the next 2 quarters.
JP Morgan, Chase,
JP Morgan, yeah.
And a lot of other places. Yeah, we're going to have a recession. It's here.
Right. So it's negative economic growth for 2 quarters.
Yes, that's going to happen.
Right.
I have no doubt. The issue is, though, that the bounce back will be much faster than what we saw after 2008. Because in 2008, that recession was driven by fundamental misalignment in the economy. This is being driven by a public health crisis that could reverse itself with the right public health interventions.
So the Chase report said that these next 2 quarters will be worse than 2008. So what does that mean in terms of negative growth?
If I remember my numbers correctly, the first 2 quarters after the 2008 crisis, the impact was about minus 2% in GDP growth. We're expecting this to be minus 3%. Again, that doesn't sound like a big number, but that's an annualized number. So this negative economic growth is going to be concentrated in these next several weeks. We will probably have never experienced such fundamental economic pain in the next few weeks. The unknown is, how's this nation going to handle it psychologically?
Is there anything that we can do to get out of this faster?
That answer goes back to the epidemiologists and the public health experts. As a non-expert, it looks like that the quicker you put in draconian controls of keeping people in their places of residence, the faster you bounce back. That's what we've seen in Korea and China. Now, that's harder to do for a whole bunch of reasons in places like Europe and the United States, but we have to do it, and we have to have the will as a population to comply.
So if you could leave listeners with just one thought when they're freaking out when they go to bed tonight, the thing they need to think of as they're falling asleep is just hang in there for 3 months.
It's about hope. Right? We've never experienced this before. If you look at what's happened in China and South Korea, we will get out of this. We will get back to some level of normalcy pretty soon. So you just got to take each day at a time. It's hard. It's easier said than done.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
Thanks, Mason.
My thanks again to Phil Powell. In the latest issue of IBJ, we have a great story from reporters Mickey Shuey and Kirk Christian about what small businesses are doing to weather this unfolding crisis. And Sam Quinn explores the challenges facing low-wage workers who typically have very little cushion for work stoppages. And Greg Andrews has a fascinating piece about the Indianapolis-based NCAA, which of course was forced to cancel March Madness. The group relies heavily on the hundreds of millions of dollars it earns annually through its TV contracts for the tournament. This raises the question of how the governing body for collegiate sports can function without that revenue. And Greg reveals that it actually has been planning for this kind of thing for years, although its event cancellation insurance might not cover pandemics. Again, you can read all these stories in the latest print edition of IBJ or online at ibj.com. I will say that it's quite a bit easier to access IBJ content if you have a subscription, which works out to less than a couple of dollars per week. So look, that's a pretty good deal. Just go to the website and hit the subscribe button. Thanks again for making time this week for the podcast, which is edited by Leslie Weidenbender. I'm Mason King. Hold on to your seats, folks. We'll be back again next week.